So I want to say welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us at tonight's event on the benefits of public financing in New York State. I am Lisa Again. I'm a counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice, where I work, among other things, on issues of money and politics, including the campaign to enact public financing for New York State. Before we go any further, I just want to extend a special thanks to the Overbrook Foundation for their generous support for tonight's event, and say thank you also to the Open Society Foundation for their funding of all of our work in money and politics. Before I introduce our illustrious panel, we're really in for a treat with these panelists tonight. I want to invite Fritz Schwartz, my colleague, to come up here and just give some opening remarks on why this is such an important issue for New York State today. Fritz is an expert in the issue of public financing, particularly New York City's program, and he has formerly chaired the New York City Campaign Finance Board. So we're privileged to hear from him tonight.
So thank you. Is this on or?
Yes.
Is it okay? Yeah. So first, welcome to everybody and thank you for coming. The Brennan Center tries to have important events on important subjects, stimulating events on important subjects, and this is certainly one of the most important subjects that can possibly be dealt with, trying to address the influence of money in politics. We have a chance to get something done in New York State this year, which people will talk about, and the hope is that New York State adopts the New York City model, which is a model a little different than most financing that you hear about in elections, most public financing. It's a model based on matching small gifts. It started in 1989 with a 1-to-1 match on $1,000. Then it was improved to a 4-to-1 match on $250, and today it's a 6-to-1 match on $175. Now, as with any other public financing system, if you join it, you then have to limit the size of the contributions you accept, and you have to limit the amounts of money that you spend in an election. But the aspect of the New York City system, which is so powerful, and Michael Malbin has done some very good research on that, as we have, the aspect that's so powerful is that when you have a match on a relatively small amount of money, it vastly increases the number of people who get involved in the political system. For example, if someone can only give $25, that produces for the candidate $175 because there's the multiple. So it's a great way to attract people who otherwise might not give money in elections and otherwise might not participate in elections. So it's a system which can be copied, should be copied. There are elements of the system that should come along with it. Non-partisan governorship by the board that I was privileged to chair, the board that oversees the elections. Strict enforcement, which may frustrate candidates sometimes, but which is necessary in order for the public to believe their money's not being wasted. But the key to this is the matching system. We have a chance in Albany. We are trying to organize people to help develop additional support. Governor Cuomo has said he's for it. We need to keep pushing on that front. And at least part of the legislature's for it. So we need a public movement to support change which increases the involvement of people in politics so that it's not big money that controls, but it's people that control. So again, thank you all very much for coming, and I hope you enjoy the evening.
Thank you very much, Fritz, for those remarks. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists for tonight. To my immediate right is Professor Michael Malbin, who is the Finance Institute and a political science professor at SUNY-Albany. And he's going to speak tonight to us about the New York City public financing system and the potential benefits of implementing a system like it for New York State. So we're very privileged to have an expert on the system here with us tonight. To his immediate right and speaking immediately after is Dr. Hazel N. Dukes, who is the president of the NAACP New York State Conference. And she will be here to discuss the ways in which public financing can support a broader civil rights agenda. And we want to thank her also now that we have the opportunity for all of her collaboration with us on our voting rights work as well. So we're very honored to have her with us tonight. To her right is Michael J. Petro, who is the Executive Vice President of the Non-Partisan Nonprofit Committee for Economic Development. And he'll be here to speak on kind of the business angle on public financing and why it is good for the economy and why businesses do support it and should support it even more. And to his right will eventually be Professor Zephyr Teachout of Fordham Law School. She's joining us a little bit late, but we'll be glad to hear from her on corruption in political campaigns and how public financing can help us to address those problems. So thanks again for joining us. We're, as I said, we're in for a treat tonight, and without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Professor Malbin. Just take a moment to
And I need to
switch places.
be able to see my slides so I know what I'm saying.
No, you're not. It's just a mouse.
Okay.
I think this works, right?
Mhm.
Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to talk about what a public matching fund system such as the kind Fritz described for New York City, what it could mean for New York State. And I'm going to base it on several years' worth of research that we've been doing at the Campaign Finance Institute on the role of small and large donors in state and federal elections. And we've also done a lot of research on New York City, including a major law review article I co-authored with Peter Brusso, who's here, and with another of my colleagues, Brennan Center, which just came out on New York City as a model for the nation and states. So I want to really start with a fairly obvious point that this is no surprise to anybody that political finance is dominated by a handful of donors who happen to be richer than normal and give a lot of money. But in the typical state, about 2/3 of the money comes from either organizations, political action committees, or from people who give $1,000 or more. In New York, it's even more, it's 78%. So the bulk of the money is coming from people who give large amounts. And in the typical state, only 15% comes from small donors, people who give, which we're defining as $1 to $250. In New York, it's 6%, which is toward the bottom. And then again, in the typical state, only about 1.5% of adults give anything at all to any state candidate. In New York, it's less than 1/2%, which puts it at the absolute bottom of the funnel. But again, the point is not about New York, it's all states. It's really low. So, you know, there are obvious questions that arise. Clearly, this raises issues of political equality, political power. Your $1,000 person is not your average person. You have a system that's clearly not representative. This is all fairly obvious, but the question is, so what? Or what can you do about that? Well, there's been a fairly standard strategy that a lot of people in the reform world have talked about for 30 years or so, that I'll describe as, let's try to restrict or restrain the people who have a lot of money, and that's the way to get a more equal system. You know, clearly there are problems with that approach, given the Supreme Court's recent rulings, but I would describe the way that had worked over the years, even before the Supreme Court ruling, even before Citizens United, in this way. This is the way it's basically worked. Now, instead of looking like this, the lid is off. But you know, this is a strategy that does not, by itself, empower people to come into the system. So, if this doesn't quite do the job, the question is what might? And we've wondered, and I will now say more than wonder, now we argue, that it's really time to shift basic paradigms, to shift the way you look at things. And this, by the way, is what I believe the effort to bring a system of multiple matching funds for small donors into New York State, what that's about. It's an idea of trying to change the system by bringing more people in, empower the many, and in fact, that doing that can actually change the fundamental balance. A lot of people are skeptical about that. They say, oh gosh, how can a lot of people, can you actually get enough people to participate so that you really can change the balance? And there's a lot of skepticism out there about this. So we said, okay, this is really great rhetoric, but does it work? What does the research show? Well, it turns out that at least we decided to look at that, and here's what the answer is. Yes. Yes. Now, let me explain why, or let me explain the evidence. And by the way, this is not on the one hand, on the other hand. This is a simple answer. Yes. Let's look at New York, what data from New York City. We can do this for any election you want where there's multiple matching funds, but we chose the most recent, 2009. And we looked at city council elections because in the mayoral race, obviously, you had one self-funded candidate who dominated that picture. So let's look at city council elections. Your typical city council member is representing a district that's as big as your typical state legislative district. These are big districts. They're running races with significant money. And Fritz described what the matching fund system looked like, 6-for-1 for the first $175. And as in any public financing system, candidates have a choice. They can opt in or opt out. If they opt out, they don't have spending limits and so forth. Okay, well, what does it look like for people who choose not to participate in the system? Chances are that it turns out that their sources of funds look pretty much like state legislative candidates all over the country. 15% from small donors, 2/3 from people who give 1,000 or more, and then non-party money is not a big deal in New York City. Those are your non-participating candidates. What about participating candidates, people who choose voluntarily to get into the system? It turns out that this multiple matching funds produces different incentives. It's not just for the donors. It's that the candidates now have an incentive to go find people who will give them money. If they can find somebody who give $175, that's worth more than a $1,000 donor. That's worth $1,225 or $50, whatever. So let me show you what it looks like. In this chart, I'm only going to show you the private money, because comparing private money to private money tells you something about the incentives on the candidates. Okay, instead of 15, it's 37% of participating candidates' money comes from people who are small donors. Now, how important is that smaller donor money to the candidates? For that, what we did was we took the public matching funds and we matched it up with each of the donors. By the way, these donors we aggregated the contributions from each donor so we could have the total amount that came from each donor to each candidate. And then we assigned the public money based on the contributions that stimulated the money. They had to live in the city, they had to be only up to a certain, under 75. And here's what it looks like. This is the value of the small donor to the participating candidates. Instead of 66% of the money being here and 15 here, it's totally reversed. It's 64% here, quadruple the original amount, 16% there, 1/4 the original percentage. And that's all coming from the multiplying effect of the incentives. The candidates can now have a reason to go out and talk to a different kind of donor. You'll hear more about that later. but it is worth their while to ask somebody, not just for political vote reasons, but it's worth their while financially to ask somebody for $25 or $50. So they do. Their behavior is different. So that's pretty impressive for New York City. The results are clear, the research is clear, we just published them, as I said. Would they transfer? So what we did to find out is we took the 2010 candidates, we took all of the contributions for 2010, and we lumped them together in the same way we talked about, so we can aggregate the amount per donor, and we said, what would happen if you put certain new policies in effect? All right, here's where the money actually came from in New York State. 6% from small donors, 47% from non-party, 31% from that. These two together are 78%. This is 6%. The governor in his State of the State address said we'd like to see lower contribution limits. Here's what would happen if you got contribution limits that were equal to the federal limit, which is $5,000 per full cycle. It would bring this up from 6 to 9%. There are other good reasons for contribution limits. This is not an argument against contribution limits, but it is telling you that contribution limits by themselves will not do much to alter the basic distribution of power. They have to do with corruption or the appearance of corruption, but they do not address this issue. What if you did put in a matching fund system that looked like New York City, 6-for-1 match for the first $175? Here's what it would look like, assuming the same donors, assuming that only the donors who gave in 2010 would give. This goes up, this doubles, right? No, it doesn't double. This goes from 6 to 9 to 30. It's 5 times as much. These go down. 30% is pretty good. But that's assuming that there's no incentive effect here, that nobody comes into the system because they're told that they're matching their money would do something. And we all know, New York is the absolute lowest donor participation rate in the entire country. And New York City is only a little bit above average. It's not way off the top like Minnesota, which is 4.5%. New York is about 1.75%, which is pretty good, but it's not. Here's what it would look like with new donors. It's, again, a total reversal. It's 54% instead of 6%. Not quite as high as New York City because you still have non-party money, you still have in here. But 54% instead of 6%. Okay, let me recap. Really simple recap. This is what it is. This is what it could be. It's really straightforward arithmetic. Took a lot of work to do the donors, but this is really straightforward. 6% of 9 times as much. But that can only happen if there's some kind of an incentive system, a public matching fund system.
Thank you very much, Professor Malbin, for really illustrating for us in such a compelling way the difference that we could see in New York City from enacting a system like New York City's. That's so helpful for us to understand how that would work. And now I want to turn it over to Dr. Dukes.
Good afternoon. I guess you wonder why I'm here. Let me tell you, give you greetings on behalf of Benjamin Todd Jellis, our president and CEO of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, known to most people as NAACP, celebrating its 103 years. The history is from lynching to now, what do we do with the political system? Thank you, Professor Mellon, for putting it out. I have looked at the New York City model, and why did we join in this? Well, Ma Green will tell you I've been around the bond too many times on this issue, fighting for inclusion. I met someone outside, and I said to her that, she said, "You must be Hazel Dukes," and I said, "Yes." And we had a small conversation, and I said, well, I'm just not going to talk about African Americans and Latinos and Asians. I'm going to include women, because just a few weeks ago, it was 40 years after Shirley Chisholm. And we saw that clip, we saw the film, and we looked back at 40 years from since Shirley Chisholm and of course Bella Abzug and Geraldine Ferrara, where are we now? When you look at Congress and when you look at the legislature and when you look at county government. And it's all about money. It's all about money. I said yesterday when Liz and I had a conversation, some of the brightest minds want to serve in public, want to be public servants. I never wanted to be, I wanted to be the agitator. Right, Mom? Kick the butt of those who get elected and don't do right. But there are so many young people, and this is across the board of what we say as minorities that include women and the growing population of Asians in our city, and just a cadre of people who have come here with good minds, love this country, and want to serve its people. I believe that public finance is the way to go. I heard someone say that the governor said he would like to see this. I'm glad he said that. He said the same thing about redistricting. He said, I'm going to do it. And he didn't do it, so I'm not waiting for that. I think the people movement will get him to do it. And so that's why I'm here this afternoon, to join the movement. It's about time in New York State that we began to see public finance. There are too many people out there waiting in the wings, and some who are there, who cannot serve their constituents because they have to go out begging for money to compete. And so they do lose the benefit of the constituents that they serve. I was in Albany last week, matter of fact, last Tuesday, and we were knocking on the doors, met with the Dean's Fellow about the funding for school and all of that, and he kind of, looked up in the skies. I was talking to him, like, I don't know what you're talking about, the people that fund me and give me money, they're not talking on the same language that you're speaking on. And so it is noted. So the NAACP, with the Fannie Lou Hamer project, the story of Fannie Lou Hamer, the woman who turned the Democratic Party upside down, they have looked at this same issue of funding. And so in 2001, the NAACP at our national convention, where we adopt resolutions, that is the policy for us, adopted a resolution calling for all of its branches, and we have thousands of people scattered across this great country of ours, to look at and support voluntary system of full public finance for elections. The resolution was supported by the Fannie Lou Hamer project, which called for reform that not only served to reduce corruption or the perception of corruption in the political process, but would enhance political equality for all. And I think that's where we need to be in America today. We don't need all these PACs. I mean, I get sick. I have to turn off CNN when I hear about the PAC, how much Ron is spending, and where Gingrich is now, and where Santorum, closing down. Not that I think they're the best candidates, but they should have a fair chance to speak to Americans. And we the people, should make the decision who is the best candidate. So I think that to have equality for us as citizens, to really think that our vote really counts, is for men and women to be conscious that if we give our $25, if we give our $175, or whatever, that we are buying in because we believe that he or she is the best candidate, will represent the quality and life of what we all want. And it goes back to me for education. It just breaks my heart to have to fight to see what we are doing to public education. I'm not against charter school if any charter people are here. But public education, what we are doing to our children, and yet we talk about competing in a global market. And so to me, it's a corruption system going on in the political process for just the basic right of public education and access to health care. And so the NAACP has supported fair election, new act, congressional public financing proposal that was introduced in the 111th and in the 112th Congress. The high cost of running, when I moved from Nassau County to New York City, I moved in the Lou Rudin building on East 68th Street. And lo and behold, I was reading the New York Times one Sunday before I moved from there. They said that was the place that every politician go. It was the highest district, zip code in New York City that gave money to candidates. I said, I'm in the wrong damn place. Let me get out of here. And so I soon made my way to Harlem. But I mean, just the idea that a zip code can say who can be the spokesperson for us, because they can go into that zip code and get thousands of dollars, while you and I might only have the 175, but still want the same thing that that group want and deserve under the Constitution. And so the National Voting Rights Institute has called public finance one of the best ways to ensure that meaningful political participation is available to all Americans. And so the NAACP in its founding and its mission and goal statement is that every American should have the process for political, social, education, political rights. And so that's why I'm here tonight. That's why we're supporting the Brennan Center and its massive movement. And I join and ask all of you who are here tonight, become as ambassadors with us as we take this movement. Let this train run over the governor and anyone else that get in our way, because we really need it, and we need to set the tone. People look at New York City as the model for other places. And so if we can do it here, they can do it anywhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dukes, for those passionate remarks, for the call to action to all of us here, and for highlighting why this is such an important piece of the civil rights agenda, and also for tying this in, importantly, to all of the other issues that all of us and other folks in this room care about. Because, of course, fixing the foundations of the democracy, fixing the system by which people are elected to serve us is also the first step toward fixing whatever policy problems we see in our state and in our country today. So thank you so much again for those remarks. So before we turn over to Mike Petro, our next panelist to the right, I'm actually going to make a presentation that builds on and really dovetails with both what Professor Malbin has said about empowering small donors, and very much with dovetails with what Dr. Dukes has said about who we're empowering and how we're giving power to people's actual constituents instead of a couple of zip codes on Manhattan's Upper East and Upper West Side. And the focus of the presentation will really be how public financing enhances diversity in our political process. So in order to do that, you'll have to give me 1 second to cue this. No, it's okay. So just bear with me one moment while I actually get the technology to cooperate with our plan. So as I said, what we've done here is we've taken first some of the work that we've done in the past with our 2010 report on New York City's public financing system, and some interviews that we did with candidates to talk to them about their incentives and really how the New York City public financing system changed their incentives and encouraged them to reach out to small donors, to donors within their own communities, rather than targeting the same wealthy few who they might otherwise depend on to fund their campaigns. And they told us that that's exactly what they were doing. So to give you just a couple of quotes, we had one 4-time city council member say that regular New Yorkers who never thought of contributing now get excited about doing so. They don't feel dwarfed by big money interests. And again, the reason why that happens, what everyone has been talking about here today, is that there's a match. People's money is amplified and their voice is amplified through the matching system. And of course we had City Council Member Jumaane Williams say that his opponents had access to big money in a way that he didn't, but that matching funds helped him keep up with them in fundraising, and that the availability of those funds makes it absolutely easier for someone like him, a non-traditional candidate, someone who doesn't have connections and money from the establishment, to run for office in New York and ultimately to prevail in his campaign. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to take these propositions and go further with them and see if we can illustrate them. And in order to do so, we had great collaboration, very kind support from Professor Malbin and his colleagues at the Campaign Finance Institute, who gave us their data from the 2009 City Council elections that allowed us to really graphically illustrate through maps of New York City, the city that we know, who is actually giving the money. We talked about the numbers of small donors and how there's a paradigm shift, in Professor Malbin's terms, to the participation of small donors, but we didn't talk about where they come from. And that was the enterprise that we undertook here to take that data, and I want to just say thank you. I know that there's a former colleague of Professor Malbin's who's here today who was very instrumental in producing that data, Peter Russo, so thank you so much to him. We took that data, we created some maps that we wanted to share with you today. So the first map that I want to show you, this is a map of New York City block groups in which individual donors gave over $1,000. So what you're looking at here in red is any block group in which a donor, at least one donor, gave over $1,000. And it may not shock you to learn there are not many such block groups. Most of the map is empty. The sort of yellowish part of the map is a place where no one could afford to give that money. And so you'll see very heavy representation on Manhattan's Upper East and Upper West Side. I won't try to name all of the places, but you can see how heavily concentrated those areas are and that they correlate very closely with predominantly wealthy, predominantly white neighborhoods in New York City. Then we moved down quite substantially, we thought, to donors over $175. And again, you're looking at the same thing. You're looking at either no donors at all over $175 or at least one donor who gave over that amount. And you're seeing that there's significant improvement, certainly, from 1,000 to this point, but you still see a lot of parts of the map where there's no representation at all, where no one was able to give over $175. And again, without trying to name all of them, you see significant parts of Queens and Brooklyn, of Upper Manhattan, and particularly the Bronx, where no one was able to give over $175 to a candidate. And then, of course, we looked at donations between $1 and $175, and now you see a totally different map. You basically see New York City the way that we actually see it in real life, where only the uninhabited portions of New York City are not colored in, and so you have somebody giving money from every block group, basically, where people live. And I think the reason to pause here and the reason to think about this again, and this goes back to what you've heard the other panelists say, is that this is not a foregone conclusion. It's not just that there are smaller donations and so more people can afford to give them, and so you have a map that looks like this. Without candidates reaching out to small donors and mobilizing their constituents and saying, we want to be funded by the people we want to serve, people wouldn't be incentivized to give even what they might be able to afford to give. So this map and the kind of representation of participation in the political process that it represents is really made possible by New York City's program. So this map is a little bit more complicated visually, but it does make a little bit of a distinct point. What we did here is, instead of just focusing on the binary question of whether at least one person gave or no person gave between $1 and $175, we actually broke the numbers apart and looked at how many donors gave within each census block group. And so we started with blue. Here blue is 0. And we sort of ratcheted up the intensity of the colors from light green to yellow to orange to red, and red represents the most donations in a single block group. And what I think this illustrates that the other map doesn't is, you could have looked at the other map and said, well, yes, but maybe it was just one person giving in every single one of those census block groups, and that wouldn't be very compelling. But what this shows you is that there actually are tremendous swaths of New York City, including, as we'll get to in a moment, areas that have a lot of low-income residents and a lot of residents who are minorities who are giving in really substantial numbers. And that is something that, again, is very much unique and a testament to New York City's system and the way it incentivizes candidates to reach out all over the map in the way that we see here. So I just want to focus on what it means to get this kind of coverage all over New York City. I think traditionally when we hear donors, unfortunately our association is donors are high-powered people, they're people who have a lot of money. That's what we hear in the media, that's what we see in our culture. And so it's really important to think about who are these folks all over the map, again, as I just showed you, who are giving. And so this is a map that really illustrates the distribution of voting age residents in New York City who are living at or below the federal poverty line. And I think one thing that it really illustrates is how concentrated low-income residents are in New York, how heavily concentrated they are in just in certain areas. And so when you see representation and significant representation in that prior map, those two prior maps of donors from those areas, that's really telling you that candidates are reaching out to constituents where they live and getting contributions and getting support and participation in low-income areas as well as the traditional bases of political donors. And so we didn't just look at low-income communities, we also looked at race, and we looked at the distribution of different racial minorities throughout New York City. Here, you see the African-American population, and in a second I'll show you the Hispanic population and also the Asian population in New York City. And one thing that really struck me as I was looking at this map is that New York City continues to be segregated to a very large extent, and you can't walk away from the map when you see that. It's very apparent. And again, you see heavy concentrations of Black residents in parts of Brooklyn and Queens, and obviously in Upper Manhattan and the Bronx, and I'm not including all the areas, but you'll see that they're really clustered together in certain communities. And again, when we look at the map that shows the kinds of participation rates that we've seen all over New York City, including in all these areas, that is something that is very different from what you see among traditional donors and what you see when candidates are only incentivized to go to the Upper East Side or the Upper West Side for their wealthy donors. And I won't belabor the point, but I'll show you here the maps of Hispanic residents in New York City. Again, you'll see the same thing, that when candidates are targeting donors in their own communities, they're really reaching out to all of these different people who look like New York City looks and not like the wealthy donors look. And the same here is true of New York City's Asian residents. So we didn't stop there. We actually did a kind of a focus or a close-up on certain parts of New York City, and I'll just kind of quickly show you what we got by doing that. So this is not all of Brooklyn. This is part of Brooklyn that covers Bedford-Stuyvesant and some of Bushwick and Crown Heights. And we know this to be heavily African-American area. We also know it to be an area where there are a lot of residents who are at or below the poverty line. And this is what we see when we look at just the donors who gave more than $1,000. Here, blue means zero. Not a single person in that block group gave over $1,000. And light green, I have to say the number here means 1 to 2. And so you see that this map is basically completely blue. It shows that there were practically no people in this entire area that were able to give that amount of money. And again, we see some improvement when we look at who gave more than 175, but we also see a key where we don't reach most of the numbers that are represented there. So we're still seeing a lot of no one giving more than $175, and a little bit of a handful of people, again, per block group, and nobody giving any more than that. And then it looks completely different when we look at people who gave between $1 and $175. Just as we saw with the city as a whole, when we look at this particular area, which, again, as I said, is predominantly African American, has a really high population of residents who are below the poverty line or at the poverty line. And we see that they're not just giving. Overwhelmingly, the map is covered with people who are giving, but that there are parts where a lot of people are giving and a lot of people are mobilized and feel like they can actually participate and make a difference, and that they won't be drowned out by big money. And so we did this, I'll just go kind of quickly to show you, we did this also in Chinatown, heavily Asian area. Here again, we also see a lot of folks who are living at or below the poverty level. Again, we see the same trend, maybe a little bit less blue, but quite a bit of blue. This is, by the way, this is not the $1,000 level. This is the over 175. We skipped the $1,000 map, which looks worse than this. You can believe me about that. And then here's how it looks once you actually look at between $1 and $175. Again, you see much, much more participation, and not just by one person, but in many areas that overlap significantly with the really low-income areas. You see a lot of participation. We did this for Bronx and Upper Manhattan, and not totally by accident. If you go back to one of the earlier maps, you'll see this is a very heavily Hispanic population. In New York City, again, you see tremendous poverty rates. And again, even for over $175, most of the map is blue. No one was able to give over $175. And again, once you look at between $1 and $175, you see not just participation, but participation in significant numbers. So I know I raced through those last maps. If anyone is interested in seeing them in more detail, we actually kind of pasted them out on the glass table that's right by the window. So later on when we break for the reception, you can look at them in a little bit more detail. But I think this really illustrates in a way that's kind of very compelling, especially for folks who live here and who know what the city looks like and know what these areas look like, who is actually giving, not only that we're getting more small donors, but who those people are and how they're very different from the folks that we're used to hearing dominate the political system. And the point of this for New York State, of course, is we looked at the city data. That's what we were analyzing here, but there's no reason to think that maps of New York State in comparable respects wouldn't look similar if we had similar incentives for all of the participants. So thanks so much for your attention. I'll put my moderator hat back on. And turn it over to Mike Petro to switch gears a little bit and talk about why this is good for the economy and why business should get behind it.
Sure. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Brennan Center. Is this on? Do we know? Yeah, it is on. And thank you for sparing me the embarrassment of having to follow Dr. Dukes, because as she was going through her magnificent presentation, I started to sweat in the back of my head. I'm thinking, oh my God, I've got to follow this icon here with my little presentation. So Lisa, you went on and did a terrific job. I represent a group called the Committee for Economic Development. It's a business-led public policy organization. What I'm going to do here today is give you a business perspective on money and politics. I'm going to first start off, after I give a brief promo about CED, start off with a story which became in 1999 the poster child for what is wrong with the political system, what's wrong with our campaign finance system. Then I'm going to talk about how big money in politics is bad for the economy and ultimately bad for business. And then I'm going to give you a business rationale for why a small dollar match is something that business can feel comfortable with and to support. First, CED, I don't know if those of you know my organization. We are a 70-year-old business-led public policy organization. We have our roots in the 1940s when the Marshall Plan came into being, and CED's trustees, business leaders, came together and helped provide the inspiration for the Marshall Plan. Our business leaders come together and put together task forces on many domestic and foreign policy issues, and I think add a much needed business perspective to some of those issues. In the late 1990s, CED released a report called Investing in the People's Business. If you remember the 96 elections when there was the sale of the Lincoln bedroom, many of our members were appalled by getting hit up for multiple contributions, and they wanted to weigh in. As business leaders, they were fed up. They were tired of having to pay a toll to talk to a congressman or a senator. So CED released Investing in the People's Business. Now you got to remember, we're a think tank made up of business leaders, and we weigh in on education issues and the economy, workforce issues, and so we entered the politics debate, the campaign finance reform debate, somewhat naively. After our release, CNN actually covered the release of our report and called it a man bites dog story because business was getting involved in this area. But in the summer of 1999, some of our CEOs started calling us and saying that they were getting letters, personal letters, from Senator Mitch McConnell, then the head of the Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee, asking them to resign from CED because of our stand on campaign finance reform. So at first, I quite frankly, I didn't think he would be that silly to put his name to a letter like that. And so at first we really didn't take it all that seriously. But then these letters became personal notes. Senator McConnell was sending personal notes to CEOs across the country telling them to resign from our board. And then we realized this is a big story here. And it was exactly what was wrong with the system. It just so happens that later in the summer we had an editorial board meeting with the New York Times. And we entered that meeting kind of wondering whether or not we should talk to them about this because we really felt uncomfortable. Our chairman, a guy named Ed Kangas, who was the CEO of Deloitte Touche Tohmatsu, who was the chairman of this report, was 10 minutes late for the meeting. So we weren't sure if we should raise this with the editorial board of the New York Times. Ed walks into the meeting and with one of the McConnell letters, walks in, slams it on the desk and says, "This is an outrage. In fact, it's extortion." And we had a business leader for the very first time talk about the fact that this is extortion, what Senator McConnell was doing. And indeed, what was implied here, as he sent those notes to business leaders across the country, was that if you continue to play with CED, I'm not going to let you play with me anymore. And you know, I had some people call me up and say, you know, this guy's an important senator to some of our business. You do realize that. And anyway, CED stuck to its guns. We never had one business leader resign from CED because of it. In fact, we recruited business leaders because they were outraged by being put in that position. So it's an important story. It's a case study, if you will, of what's wrong with the political system. Now, let me also walk you through some of the other things that I think that are at play here, and why this is bad for it's bad for business, it's bad for the economy. First, I would argue that there is the appearance of corruption or corruption, depending on how you look at it. A political process that promotes perceptions that government policies are open to the highest bidder is not in accord with the basic tenets of a democratic government, nor is it conducive to a strong business environment. If public policy decisions are made or appear to be made on the basis of political expenditures, policy will be suspect. Now, the CED report that we released in 1999 had many of the tenets of the McCain-Feingold legislation. We called for ending soft money contributions, for reforming issue ads, but we also called for a low-dollar match of congressional contributions across the country, and I'll get to that in a minute. But getting back to the the corruption aspect, I don't need to remind people here in this audience what effect money had to play in this recent economic collapse that we had in 2008 and 2009. If anybody in this room has a question about that, all you have to do is follow the money. So it affects the economy and it affects business. And business leaders recognize that at some level. Now, I'm going to sort of end here and tell you that CED has joined the New York Lead effort. We're pleased that Bill Donaldson, the former SEC chairman, a CED trustee, has joined the New York Lead effort. We're working with the Brennan Center. We have some 50 trustees in New York to support the low-dollar match. Now, I'm not going to get into talking to you about why it's a good thing, because we've heard that from some of our speakers. But when you talk to business leaders about the political system and the lack of competition that exists there currently, they see that, and again, they're business leaders. Competition is a good thing. It's good for the economy and it's good for business. And they were appalled, quite frankly, and somewhat naive, but appalled by the fact that these people get reelected time after time after time. And I think what was significant when we approached our business leaders about this issue was that they stepped back and they said, wait a minute, competition's good for the economy, it ought to be good for the political system. That's how you get business leaders engaged around this issue. So as I mentioned, CED is pleased to be part of this effort. Some of our members think that business fares better when they compete in the marketplace than the political arena. That's certainly what we've talked about in the past. And I'm pleased to be a part of this panel here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike, for giving us that really important and different perspective, and maybe upending a little bit of conventional wisdom on the business perspective on this issue. So we really appreciate your participation. And turning it over to round us out, I want to welcome, I didn't have a chance to do that earlier, welcome Zephyr Teachout of Fordham Law School, and we're pleased to have you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great, I'm really thrilled to be here. I teach election law, and basically Brennan Center does half my teaching for me. Whenever there's a question, we say, well, has the Brennan Center thought about it? And if they haven't, probably nobody has. And just the extraordinary work of the Brennan Center, and then I've followed Professor Malbin for years. Absolutely love his work, and honored to be with both of you. So I'm going to be brief. I'm gonna, just a law professor hat for 1 minute. This is constitutional, the court will allow it to happen. The most recent signals from the court in McComish case after Citizens United suggested that this kind of matching funds system would be constitutional. I think that's very important. Other kinds of matching fund systems are not, that are triggered by spending, but the low dollar match is. So there's a huge window to drive in here. Should not be a big concern. That's it for law. I'm supposed to be the reasonable professor. I'm not going to be. I think this is the fight. I really do. I think the fight is matching funds, and I think the fight is New York. Tell you one story about why I believe this. I almost ran for Congress in 2005, 2006 in Vermont, not. And so I did in a pretty small state. I did what you're supposed to do. You go talk to people. What do you need to do? Well, first you need to get $100,000 before the press is going to take you seriously. This is not big money, right? So then, okay, how do I raise $100,000? I make a list of 50 people that I know that will give me $2,000. So I want you to go through this process because it's such a radicalizing process for me. Just imagine for a second you're going to run. So we'll call them all John. So I thought about my friend John because he's rich and he's very involved in internet fights. And he cares a lot about net neutrality. So I found myself thinking about John and his other rich friends and thinking about things that I had thought about net neutrality. And so I spent a couple days thinking about net neutrality. I promise you, nobody in Vermont had ever approached me about net neutrality. And then I thought about my other friend, John. And my friend John cares enormously about gun control. And he and his wife donate a lot in the area of gun control. Well, I don't know how much you know about Vermont politics. It's not a big issue in Vermont. Again, I actually care about gun control. I actually care about net neutrality. But what I found in that first 4 days is that my mind was entirely occupied, oriented towards the concerns of John and John and John and John, none of whom were the constituents that I was thinking about. So if we'd had a matching fund system in Vermont at the time, instead of making a list of those 50 people who might give $2,000, which we're already talking to 1% right there, basically. I mean, you probably know that. I would have been thinking, okay, what is an issue that 1,000 Vermonters care about? What about dental care? Or what about credit cards? Or student loan payments? None of which, my wonderful friends John, don't think about those things. They're not wrong not to think about them. But it would totally reorient my brain. And so why I care so much about this is that what I see as the function and the purpose of designing a campaign system is to create structures so that those who represent us are thinking as much as possible about all of us equally and orienting themselves as much as possible to all our interests equally. Now, they may not always agree with us, but they'll at least be thinking about our concerns about teeth and credit cards instead of the concerns of the 1%. So for me, that's why this is the game. Great example we see of that in the response to the financial crisis. Not the crisis itself is, I was involved in lobbying on Dodd-Frank. I think we were outspent in 2 years, a year per day, something like that. The amount of money we spent in a year was the amount of money the banks were spending in a day. I was talking to an old organizer about things like breaking up the banks and the financial transactions tax. And he said, look, the numbers on these are so high, it doesn't matter how we message it, which is unusual for anybody in DC to say. But these were, the numbers on like serious banking reform. Didn't happen. And we weren't the only ones who knew those numbers. Members of Congress knew those numbers. They saw the financial transactions tax numbers. This is a great populist issue, especially in response to the crisis. They're not touching it because they're thinking about John and John and John, and John and John and John are thinking about totally different things than the people in their district. 3. Super PACs. I assume there's going to be questions about that. They're a big deal. They're a huge problem. It's not trivial. This doesn't solve that. That said, in most races in the country, our job, and in New York, our job is to create a system where people can get to the level where they're heard. That's our job. And if there's enough money in the matching fund system so they can be heard in their district, super PACs are a problem. They're a threat. They're a fight. But who is going to run is going to change. How they're going to talk is going to change, and who they're speaking to is going to change. So while we separately try to change the court, the matching funds project can be amazingly important. Fourth and last, I think the New York fight's really important for the country. People know that the system is corrupt, but they don't believe that there's a way to fix it. And I don't know that we have numbers on this, but I don't believe people know what fair elections is, and I believe they don't trust it when they hear it. That if they don't actually have some sense of how the mechanism works, it's like the Clean Skies Act and the Clean Ground Act and every other messaged idea, that it doesn't sound true. Well, I think the best way to get to public education is through a good old-fashioned street fight. The way that people can learn about how the fair election system works is to have the fight. Have politicians duking it out, accusing each other, explaining it. That works to me better than any amount of public education campaign. So I really want to win this one, but I really think it's worth fighting even if we don't.
Thank you so much, Professor Teachout, for those remarks, both in your sort of law professor hat and otherwise. They were extremely informative and really helpful to us. And I guess to sort of start off the question and answer session that comes now, I want to start close to where you left off. I think it was your point 3 about super PACs. I might be wrong about this, but I don't know if the dirty words Citizens United were actually explicitly uttered by anyone on the panel yet. But we get a lot of questions about that, and a lot of questions of how does this fit in with that? Citizens United and its effects and the torrents of public money and purportedly independent spending, and super PACs are what is on people's mind about campaign finance right now, and sometimes it's hard to make the connection to what we're talking about tonight. So I know we've heard already from Professor Teachout on that, but I wanted to see if the other panelists wanted to sort of add to that and to say how is public financing relevant? Where do they see it fitting in the post-Citizens United world that we live in? So I'll start with Professor Malbin if I can.
I want to reiterate, or I want to strengthen, or at least support something that Zephyr Teachout said. Money can give you a voice. Money cannot make people want to listen to you. The important thing is to make sure that candidates can be heard, that new kind of candidates can come out and they can be heard. The more money gets spent by these super PACs, there's a law of diminishing returns. The big thing is to make sure that people who can go turn to other kinds of constituents can make their argument. To me, that's the most important thing about the whole process. And let the rich people spend. Now, I know that there are people who want to change the Constitution. Let's say that even if you can't, I would say, get 5% of the people in this country to play, and it's a new game.
Thank you. I just want to, go ahead.
I also believe that we can duke it out. I have to agree. I think it's going to have to be a people movement. I think you're going to have the candidates duke it out. You know, you got to put them on the stand, witness stand, and said, do you want to represent your constituency, or do you want to represent money? And I think that's that's where the League of Women come in with their education pieces that they do, and other groups. I think we can win over Super PAC. I think we can. We just haven't tried it as of yet, but I think it can be done.
I think that Citizens United might be the best thing that ever happened to the public financing movement. I think that Enron helped get McCain-Feingold passed. all right? It was sort of out there, but when Enron happened, it got passed. I think that there will be a big-time scandal in the coming months, if not a year or so from then. And I think that's going to be the opportunity for movements like this. And I totally agree with you. I think the whole country is watching New York State right now as far as the public financing movement goes. And we have to win this battle. Because if we don't win this, it's going to be a setback. But I think it was the best thing that ever happened.
Thank you. So since this is an event about participation, I think it's high time to turn this over to some questions from the audience. So I think we'll start kind of in the way back over there and work our way around the room and get some public mics.
Thanks. This is a question sort of for Professor Malbin or anybody else to jump in, but obviously, we've heard criticism of public funding as welfare for politicians, and why should our good tax dollars be given to politicians? And with respect to the 6-to-1 ratio that's used in New York, I've heard folks say that seems too much. Where's the role of the private money? Isn't this just public money? Wouldn't we be better off with a lower match, 2-to-1, 4-to-1? And given all the attention you paid to the numbers and your studies of New York as it changed its system from 4-to-1 up to 6-to-1, I wonder if, Professor Malbin, you could talk about whether you think that 6-to-1 is kind of the sweet spot, or whether you would recommend something a little higher, a little lower.
New York City started with a 1-for-1 match for the first $1,000. It then went to a 4-for-1 match for $250. The magic number for New York City's treasury was $1,000. So they kept upping the match and reducing the amount that would be matched. I can't speak definitively about the difference between 4 and 6. I can about the difference between 1 and, let's say, either 4 or 6. We just haven't had enough elections yet to talk about 4 and 6. But multiple match for small contributions changes the way the candidates look at the world. And it tells them that it's worth going down to the street corner to get people to give little contributions. There's really very little doubt about that. Is it welfare for politicians? No. Candidates have to work for it. You can call it workfare for politicians, but the truth is, what it really is it's a should we call it a force multiplier, if I can use that analogy? Force multiplier for citizens. No politician gets anything as a matter of right under this kind of a program. Everything comes only after they persuade somebody to give money and put their own skin in the game.
We have a comment over here, so maybe we'll come first.
I can comment to Adam, and I can comment on what Adam and Michael said humbly, because I was the author of the 4-to-1 match, and I received more public money from New York City than anyone ever, $12 million, a little less than my opponent self-financed that year. But I'm not only surprised that the panel hasn't said Citizens United before you said it, but you haven't said 1% and 99%. I can't believe the most effective slogan in modern history has passed so quickly into a cliche that people don't use it. It was Mitch McConnell, who was corrupt on these matters, who came up with a brilliant political one-liner. Campaign finance and matching funds is food stamps for politicians. I don't have to explain why food stamps and politicians are bad words, but give him credit for his theming and messaging. It worked. The movement behind this, through now Occupy Wall Street and others, have come up with a rebuttal that is as good or better. It is, well, either you have a democracy funded by the 1% for them, as your data, Michael, shows, or you have a democracy funded by the 99%, and that's us, through small taxpayer, etc. And as you and others start to really push the rock over the mountain in New York State and elsewhere, I would just urge you, and some of us in this room are working very closely with Occupy Wall Street and their theming and their boots on the ground. No one thinks better about this than Brennan, but I don't know how many thousands of people Brennan has gotten on the streets around the country, please don't lose sight of this extraordinary distinction. There's a senator I know who said she loves debating Republicans in the cloakroom, because now whenever they come up with one of these wacky ideas on bankruptcy for corporations but not students, she will say, as a female, will say, oh, you're for the 1%? And she reported to me, that immediately throws them on the defensive. No, I'm not real, but you gotta understand. So I think it's an enormous lever for everyone in this room.
Now that we're on this side, maybe we can kind of wind our way to this gentleman over here and then.
Thank you. I think, I may be wrong about this, but I think Professor Malbin had coined the term floors without ceilings at one point.
I've used it. I won't take credit
You've
for
used
it.
the term. And I wanted to raise that term with the following subject. The New York City system, I think there's been a compelling case made here tonight regarding the multiple match, but that's one element of the system. And another important element that's specifically associated with public financing is spending limits, which has been a feature of the city program since the beginning. And I would ask the panel to address, in a post-Citizens United world where there are unlimited corporate independent expenditures, in a post-Arizona free enterprise world where the tools that had been available to a public financing system to combat both independent spending and unlimited non-participant spending have been rendered unconstitutional, in a post-Albany case world where that has been extended to the specific provisions in New York City, striking those bonus provisions down, and in a post-Michael Bloomberg world where we've seen the impact of unlimited candidate spending, the potential here in New York City. I would ask the panel, is there still a case to be made for saddling public finance candidates with spending limits? Or is this an opportunity to go one better on the New York City system by enacting a public financing program for the state that has a multiple match without saddling candidates with spending limits?
Thank you for that question. Professor Malbin, do you want to address it, or I can also?
I don't think spending limits work in the current legal environment. I don't think they worked in the previous legal environment. I think you can limit candidates' spending. You cannot limit the spending of people outside. Now, if you amend the Constitution to say, yeah, you can limit independent spending, then you have all sorts of border questions, such as what about issue speech, what about this, that, or the other. In the article that my co-authors and I wrote, we argued in favor of the following setup: multiple matching system, and then at some point, the government money stops. And when the government money stops, the candidate by then should have managed to develop a small donor base because the candidates had an incentive to do it. The candidate should be able to keep going with limited contributions. And the contributions, the limit, you can set it wherever you think is prudent, but the point is that that candidate ought to be able to keep on raising money, and with the incentive to go in the system in the first place, and multiply the effect. We don't have an empirical test of that. I'm convinced it would work, and that's what the current federal bills now would do for both presidential and congressional. It's what people are talking about in other states, but it's not law yet anywhere, but it's the approach I think would be the most prudent or work best.
We will take a couple more questions and then, wait. Yes, over here.
Hi, I have a question for Professor Teachout. I'm a member of Occupy Wall Street. I'm currently working with a group called Ending Corporate Personhood, Getting Money Out of Politics. We're going to be attending the town halls coming up next week. And I was wondering if you could give some advice on what we should be focusing on after that, what steps we should be taking, that sort of thing.
I mean, I really think this is a New York a New York fight, and I feel really unqualified to answer it, because I think it's a strategic question of where the levers of power are in New York. I mean, I really think that's the question, where to put the pressure. So, I mean, I don't have a problem with, I'm on the activist legal working group at Occupy as well. But I don't have a problem with you know, anyway, I really do think it's a New York question. So I'm interested in Occupy playing my assessment, Occupying an aggressive role with the governor in ways that perhaps inside players might not.
We'll take 2 more questions. We have so many, well, maybe it'll be 3 more questions, but you've been very patient, so thank you for that.
I was just hoping Professor Malbin or anyone could just speak about the impact the public financing system has on candidates, not in terms of their behavior with voters, but with their success at the polls versus perhaps better finance candidates who aren't opting into a public financing system.
To answer that, you have to go across lots of jurisdictions, and here's what we know. We know that you cannot equate more money with winning. We know you can equate lack of money with losing. And there's just no question. And what public funding does is, and we do know that it has made more candidates choose to run in states where there are fewer uncontested seats. In the states where you have public funding, there are fewer uncontested seats in New York City. There's more contest. People have to fight. They have to argue. The game has changed in that way. You can't say more incumbents lose. What we can say is that there's more of a real political contest in more districts, and that's true anywhere where you have candidates who've raised money. It's just harder to raise money if you're not a rich person and not connected that way. Harder without the public match.
We'll take 2 more questions, and then maybe I'll ask if the panelists do have a few more minutes to stick around for the reception. Other folks can get to ask their questions as well. Yes, I guess 2 rows from the back, right in the aisle. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to the panel for an excellent presentation, and to the person who had the unenviable task of assembling such a star-studded panel. My question perhaps follows to some extent on the prior one, and that is not necessarily the effect of small donors participating now and whether somebody wins or loses, but the effect on the voter who now participates by donating money. Is that voter more likely to go to the polls? So we have more participation by small donor persons.
Almost anybody who gives money was going to vote anyway. But let me take your question in a different way. There's all sorts of other ways beyond voting where people can participate. You know, really, Zephyr should be answering this because of the work she did in the campaign before. But the fact is that putting a little bit in and then persuading your friends to put a little in, volunteering, becoming an activist, those things are linked. She gave me what is the absolute best line I've ever used in anything, so I really want to turn this over. It was about presidential politics being the entry-level drug for participation.
Gateway drug, yes.
Gateway drug? Go ahead, really, let Zephyr. There's no question that the volunteering and giving are reciprocal.
Yeah, well, I mean, we really see eye to eye on this, and I love his work on this, but it changes the incentives of campaigns to engage people in lots of different ways because they know that the relationship between donating and organizing is high. So then it changes the whole structure of the way campaigns think, which changes the structure of the way people operate. I mean, my dream is also the 5% dream. 5% of Americans in the 1950s were presidents of their own local voluntary association. To me, like Michael, if you hit 5%, you have a truly vibrant democracy. That's sort of enough insulation.
Hey, And if I could just add my 2 cents here. So in the other side of my life is that in the 1980s, I was one of those bad political fundraisers that we're all talking about. I was a young Democrat in the 1980s, if you can imagine. It was a difficult task. But one of the things that I did is I organized a grassroots fundraiser for Geraldine Ferraro in Indianapolis, Indiana in 1984 during the presidential campaign. And we got 500 people at $50 a head to come and just hear her speak. They didn't even get to shake her hand. 500, mainly women, who were so inspired by the fact that a woman was on the ticket. And I'm telling you, every one of those people who gave $50 voted in that election. And it also that was the very, very first time that I realized the power of what a small contribution can really mean.
Can I just follow up a little bit, because Zephyr didn't talk about herself that much. So you remember the bat on the Howard Dean website, right? Give a little bit. Zephyr's job in that campaign was to make sure that those people became volunteers, right? And that's, if you want to know somebody how this is reciprocal, you really should talk to her during the reception.
So you're gonna go.
I think we'll take one last question, and I'll hold us to it. So thank you for being patient.
Well, this may be terrible naive to all these professors, but does all these funds go to just the what do you call it? The American democratic system, which is endorsed by 2 parties. They go to, what does it do to emergence of the 3rd party? I mean, this is very important because, all our mayors say, well, you lost the vote here because, lower New York is Democratic and upper New York is Republican. Is this going to ever change the bullet vote? I mean, it's very discouraging. You're one of the other parties saying, how can you win? You change parties, that's what you do.
So, if I can compare this kind of a public funding system to other kinds, if you don't mind me doing that. In the presidential general election, when it worked, and it worked for many, many years, they give a big flat grant to people. When you give a big flat grant, you don't want everybody to get a big flat grant. That will break the treasury. So there are these high qualifying thresholds, and they're tough to meet. And they tend to discriminate or give problems to third parties. Well, matching funds don't do that. They don't have to do that. If you only have 10 donors and that's all you get matched, fine. You have not much money is, quote, wasted. You can treat it.
Have a qualifying.
It goes by, it's the candidate has to raises the money. That money's matched. The threshold, you can make an easy qualifying threshold if you want it. There's no reason not to.
Thank you very much. If I could just kind of augment that it really goes to the idea that this system is one that kind of builds on itself incrementally over time. And for one candidate, as they raise more small qualifying contributions, they get more money. And so as they become more successful in getting the message out, particularly if they're a third-party candidate, they can mobilize that base. And over time, the system does encourage the emergence of third parties. So I think everybody has been tremendous. Thank you for your participation from the audience. Thank you so much to our panelists. And we really appreciate all of your contributions. And thank you to Dr. Dukes in absentia. And before we close, I just want to make one really important point. As you've heard tonight, this is part of an actual live campaign to get this law passed in New York State. And so we're very pleased tonight to have with us some friends and allies from Citizen Action. We have right over here Jesse Lehman from Citizen Action, who has flyers and information about how you guys can get more involved in this effort. So thank you so much again. Thanks for coming, and please stick around for more conversation and refreshments and talking to Jesse.
Well, let's clap for them first. And I know I'm keeping you all from wine and cheese, so I'm going to be really quick. I'm going to start that handing out there, and I'm going to start that handing out there. One of these says Manhattan on them, and one of them says Brooklyn. If you do live in Manhattan, please take the Manhattan one. If you do live in Brooklyn, please take the Brooklyn one. We're doing big town halls, even bigger than this, maybe 3 times bigger than this, next week, Wednesday and Thursday nights, and inviting all of our New York State Assembly people to be there and see that people actually care about reform. We have about half of the Assembly people from Brooklyn and Manhattan RSVP'd already, so we need a big crowd to show that this is not just 50 people in a room at the Brennan Center, it's maybe 250 people in a town hall at the New York Hotel Trades Council. So please do come to one of those town halls. That's my big ask. I'm going to be around. The flyers are going around. You can ask me about them. They're Wednesday night in Brooklyn,
Thursday night in Manhattan, and it's how we're going to twist the arms of our assembly people to actually bring this bill out and pass it in April. That's it. Thank you.